This section of your DVD demonstrates the Bondo method for installing a Karran undermount sink into a custom laminate countertop. This method is the preferred method of installation for all laminate finishes and is the required method for use with high-definition, satin, semi-gloss, and high-gloss laminates. Before you begin installation, inspect the sink for any damage. Check both the rim and corners of the bowls. Check the sink rim for flatness. In rare cases, additional straightening may be needed. If needed, place a wood spacer block between the bowls on the underside of the sink to provide additional straightening. Permanently fasten the block in place with hot melt glue or seam adhesive once desired straightness is achieved. Measure the depth of the rim. It should be 3/4 inch, the same thickness as standard 3/4 inch particle board substrate. If the rim is thicker than 3/4 inch, use a template and top bearing router bit to trim to 3/4. If using 5/8 inch substrate, remember to trim the rim to 5/8 inch thickness. Mark the sink center line on the particle board, then a second line 2 to 2.5 inches back from the front edge of the countertop. Place the sink onto the back of the particle board in the required position, using the registration marks to locate the sink correctly. Use a pencil to trace around the sink. Hold the pencil vertically as you trace around the sink to offset the cutout line approximately 1/8 of an inch. Use a jigsaw to make the cutout. Cut on the line. When doing multiple sinks of the same design, make a template and use a router to save time. After the cutout has been made, place the sink into the hole to check for fit. A minimum gap of approximately 1/8 of an inch should be visible. Remove the sink. Position the laminate on what will be the top side of the countertop. Be sure to account for your overhangs on the perimeter of the countertop. Then trace the sink hole onto the laminate. Attach wood support strips with screws or glue and staples to the underside of the particle board. Make sure they overhang the sink cutout opening by about 1/2 inch. Do not place wood strips where they may interfere with faucet hole placement. Attach the front edge buildup at this time. Flip the countertop over and place thin strips of laminate adhered with silicone to the wood support strips. This is done to slightly raise the sink rim above the surface of the substrate. Drop the sink into the cutout hole, letting it rest on the undermount support strips. Make sure it is centered in the cutout hole and that the center lines on the sink and countertop line up. Check that the top of the rim is slightly higher than the top of the substrate using a straight edge. The sink should be approximately 1/16 inch higher than the substrate. Adjust height of the sink with laminate strips if necessary. Mix Bondo or equivalent body filler product. Squeeze the Bondo into the gap between the sink and substrate. Fill above level of the substrate to allow for shrinkage and leave to harden. Using a belt sander with a coarse grit sandpaper, 50 to 80 grit works best. Sand the rim of the sink and the Bondo until the sink rim, Bondo, and substrate are completely flush and level. Check with a straight edge as you sand to ensure that you don't produce any dips in the sink or substrate. Drawing pencil lines perpendicular to the sink wall about 8 inches long can be a good visual guide during this process. An 8-inch orbital sander may also be used, but a belt sander is typically quicker. After sanding, clean sink and countertop with compressed air. Adhere masking tape around the inside of the bowl wall, about 1/8 inch below the top of the rim. This is done to catch adhesive drips and make the sanding process easier. Use the sink cutout to cover the marked area on the back of the laminate. Apply contact adhesive to the laminate. Use the sink cutout to cover the sink. Apply contact adhesive to the particle board. Clean both the back of the laminate and the sink rim with a denatured alcohol and a clean white rag. Prepare a solid surface seam adhesive cartridge. Use a color that closely matches the color of the sink. Apply one continuous bead around the rim of the sink. The bead should be applied about an 1/8 inch back from the inner front edge of the sink and should be 1/4 to 3/8 inch in thickness. Use dowels to position laminate over particle board substrate. Attach the laminate to the particle board. Roll the laminate over the substrate as normal with a J-roller. Over the area of the sink rim, roll the laminate very lightly. Then completely cover the sink area with 2 sheets of particle board. These will provide pressure while the adhesive cures. Allow adhesive to cure completely, approximately 30 to 45 minutes depending on brand of adhesive and the climate. Several options are available for doing the final trimming of the laminate. You may use a standard router with a 7 to 8 degree bevel bit with tapered nylon bottom bearing. You may use a solid surface roundover bit with tapered nylon bottom bearing set at the correct height. The preferred method is a tilt-based trim router with a 1/4 inch straight cut bit with bottom bearing. Simply adjust the angle of the base to 8 degrees. This is 2 degrees more than the angle of the sink walls, which are typically 6 degrees. Once trimmed, remove tape. You may prefer to do an initial trim with a straight cut bottom bearing bit, then remove the tape, then do a second close trim with the tilt-based router set at 8 degrees. Sand the edge of the laminate and upper wall of the sink with a random orbital sander. Bring the edge to a matte finish, usually a 60 micron or 220 grit, though a 150 grit would also be suitable. Sand until laminate and sink are smooth and no seam can be felt. Use a file to slightly bevel and soften the edge of the laminate. Lightly buff the entire sink with a maroon Scotch-Brite pad. If faucet hole placement is known, drill holes using a 1.5 inch hole saw. Place a bead of silicone around the faucet hole seal ring wall and insert into hole. Wipe up excess silicone. If faucet hole placement is not known, be sure to include these along with the installation instructions with the countertop when the top is delivered to the job site. Please note that sinks with integrated faucet decks do not require faucet hole seal rings. Your sink is now installed and ready to be delivered to the customer.